На Западе закрывают на это глаза, но это уже тоже.
The terrifying statistics on the bloody crimes committed by the Kiev regime show no sign of stopping. After all, they are deliberately targeting children. The West is turning a blind eye to this, but that is a well-worn tactic. They are not just turning a blind eye, they are actively encouraging it in every way possible. They justify these barbaric acts, they cover up the terrorist attacks, and they whitewash the very neo-Nazi nature of those responsible for all this. But we forget nothing. We continue to highlight the war crimes being committed by the Kiev regime with the full support of a self-appointed, so-called progressive, and I use that word in inverted commas, section of the international community. We will ensure that everyone guilty of causing pain, suffering, and the deaths of children receives the punishment they deserve. They won't stand a chance on the battlefield. This is obvious to them, and it's obvious to those who supply them with weapons. And that is why they are targeting civilians. President of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen has been given her own program, as if Ukrainian statehood would have managed without her. But I can tell you this, it would have flourished, were it not for all these Western European figures. Although what sort of Western European figures are they really? The whole essence of Ursula von der Leyen has nothing to do with her homeland, nor with Germany, nor with the European Union, but with those financial groups with which she has direct ties, groups that couldn't care less about the fate of Europe, whether Western or Central Europe, as long as they can line their own pockets. They operate openly, without any reproach from Westerners. This is the sort of extremist website, Mirotvorots, that has never once been the subject of discussion by these very same Western human rights organizations as something utterly reprehensible. Not merely unfit for consumption, but a disgrace to all of humanity. No, they're not interested. The most cynical thing is that the website publishes the personal details of minors. Children are being added in whole groups. Among them are not only Russians, but also citizens of Belarus, Ukraine itself, Azerbaijan, Israel, Uzbekistan and Moldova. However absurd, and in fact, how barbaric and immoral it may sound, the children are accused, and I quote, of attempting to undermine the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. And, to quote directly, of deliberately violating Ukraine's state border. They are accusing children. They cannot move about without the consent of adults and without being accompanied by someone, be it their parents, relatives, or the organizers of the trips, who assume responsibility for these children under an agreement with their parents. In 2025, more than 100 children and teenagers from Russia ended up on that very same extremist website. In January, its database contained details on 25 children aged, just think about this, from 2 to 3 years old. It is in this very pantheon that the remains of Bandera, Shukhevich, and all the Nazi scum will be buried. This will constitute a desecration of the sacred sanctuary that is unprecedented in its cynicism. Now, for the Kiev regime, for Bankova Street, for those who run Ukraine, the Kiev-Pechersk lava is not a place for communing with God. It is a place for worshipping Satan. Administrative penalties in the form of fines totaling 3,400 hryvnias were imposed on a total of 3 Kiev teachers, I quote, for using the language of the aggressor state during the teaching process. I have a suggestion for teachers in Ukraine. When they come after you next time, tell them you were speaking in the official language of the United Nations. Let them try to issue a fine. Before discussing something new that has not yet been voiced and formulated, it would still be right to clarify the old issues, in particular the discussions that have already taken place on the relevant ideas. What has been going on in Brussels regarding the oil price cap cannot be described as anything but a farce. Attempts to undermine our energy cooperation with partners against the backdrop of the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz will inevitably lead to further destabilization of markets, fragmentation of world trade, inflation, a decline in living standards and a deterioration in growth prospects in most countries worldwide, which will hit the poorest nations, those dependent on imports of energy, fertilizers and food, the hardest. We tried to temper the zeal of the active supporters of the so-called plan to tighten anti-Russian restrictions. Apparently, these efforts have failed, and we note that against the backdrop of Washington's huge problems, including the Iranian issue, the prospects of the collapse in the energy markets, rising inflation in the run-up to the November congressional elections, the hawks within U.S. President Trump's own party are clearly doing him a disservice. The ineffectiveness of sanctions against Russia has been proven in practice. We would hope that the current U.S. administration remembers that the law passed by Congress in Trump's first term, which was actually called the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, severely restricted the U.S. president's ability to develop pragmatic approaches towards, amongst others, our country. It is clear that the adoption of this new anti-Russian initiative is also intended, quite literally, to tie the White House's hands in implementing its foreign policy course and to complicate efforts to stabilize bilateral relations with Russia, particularly in the trade and economic sphere. This would be tantamount to shooting oneself in the foot and would, first and foremost, harm the United States itself.
$25 करोड़ गरीब गरीबी को परास्त करके बाहर निकले।
For the good of our nation, let's work together and let's truly make America great again.
The fastest news breaks.
Requested PM saying that look, you will have to speak to Putin and to Zelensky.
The biggest news makers.
The relationship with India is probably the most important bilateral relationship the U.S. will have for the rest of this century.
The capital delivered quite an election result today.
Expert analysis.
The million-dollar question today is how to stop this dance of death.
Ground reports.
I'm standing at the crossroad of the Kumbh Mela. Behind me are more than 100 entry ghats.
Long-form interviews.
Exclusionary politics is reflected in Manipur case as well. You don't bother because this is a small state.
Have you ever wondered what happens when a banking dynasty meets tides of world history, intrigue, and a dash of myth?
Why exactly did the US topple the Sheikh Hasina government?
HT videos. We don't just break news, we break it down.